The call came when I was changing Elaine's bandages. My sister flinched as I gently lifted the gauze from her surgical scar, the harsh hospital lighting making her look older than her 73 years. The physical therapist had warned me this would be the most painful part of her recovery, but neither of us was prepared for how slow and agonizing the process would be. When my phone rang, I almost ignored it. Reception in the rural Missouri hospital was spotty at best, and most calls dropped before I could even say hello. But something, mother's intuition perhaps, made me hurry to answer. "Mom," my daughter's voice came through in broken fragments. "Mom, can you? Me? Sarah? You're breaking up, honey. He changed. Locks." Her words dissolved into static, then returned with sudden clarity. 6 hours in the rain. A cold weight settled in my stomach. "Sarah, where are you calling from? What happened?" The connection stabilized, as if the universe itself recognized the gravity of the moment. "The general store. Mom, Derek changed the locks on the house." Her voice broke. "I've been locked out since this morning. He said we don't live there anymore. You and me. We don't live there anymore." I closed my eyes, the pieces clicking into place with a terrible finality. The late-night calls Derek had been making when he thought Sarah couldn't hear. His parents' unexpected visit that had somehow stretched from a weekend to 3 weeks. The increasingly dismissive tone in his texts when I asked about the property's upkeep. "Are you somewhere dry now?" I kept my voice calm. Decades of handling farm emergencies serving me well. "Yes, Mr. Peterson let me use the store phone and gave me coffee." Sarah sniffled, and I could picture her, my strong, capable daughter, reduced to seeking charity at the general store 30 miles from any real town. "My car's still dead. I had to walk 4 miles in the storm to get here." "Is Derek still at the house?" "Him and his parents. They watched me from the window, Mom. For hours. They watched me standing in the rain, and nobody came until dark." The raw hurt in her voice made my chest ache. "Derek finally came out and said they'd had a family meeting and decided we were done. That you abandoned the place by going to help Aunt Elaine, and I wasn't contributing enough to deserve to stay." "I see." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too measured, too controlled for the fury building inside me. "What do I do, Mom? All our things, my clothes, my laptop with all my work files, Dad's pocket watch, everything's in there. He won't even let me get my stuff." I looked over at Elaine, who was watching me with concern despite her own pain. My older sister, always the fighter, always the one who faced problems head-on, while I preferred finding the quiet way through difficulties. But sometimes, quiet solutions were the most devastating. "Listen carefully, Sarah. Go to the Blue Jay Motel on Route 16. Ask for Mabel at the front desk. Tell her you're Martha Reynolds' daughter, and you need the emergency room. She'll understand." "The emergency room? Mom, I'm not hurt. It's what we call it, honey. It's a room your father and I kept there for years, paid up through 2030. You have a motel room? Why would you? Your father didn't trust banks entirely, not after his parents lost their first farm in the savings and loan crisis. We kept certain things in places nobody would think to look." I smiled faintly, remembering Thomas and his contingency plans. "Get yourself warm and dry. There's cash in the bedside table and a change of clothes that should fit you." "Mom, I don't understand any of this." "You will." I glanced at my watch. Nearly 7 p.m. in Missouri, which meant I had about an hour before the law offices closed on the West Coast. "I need to make some calls. Stay at the motel tonight and call me from there. The landline should work better than the store's connection." "What about Derek? And the house?" "Mom, that's our home. Everything we have is there." "Not everything, Sarah. Not by a long shot." A plan was already forming in my mind, built on foundations Thomas had laid years ago. "Trust me for 3 days. Can you do that?" Yes." Her voice steadied slightly. 3 days. I trust you." After reassuring her once more and disconnecting, I turned to Elaine, who raised a questioning eyebrow despite the pain it clearly caused her. "Thomas's plan?" she asked simply. I nodded. "It seems my son-in-law has decided to claim our family property for himself. Always thought he was a weasel." Elaine attempted to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. "Need me to make calls? I can't walk worth a damn yet, but my phone finger still works fine." "No, this is my fight." I squeezed her hand gently. "Rest. I'll handle Derek." In the hospital corridor, I found a quiet alcove with slightly better reception and dialed a number I knew by heart, but hadn't called in years. "Mackenzie and Walsh, how may I direct your call?" "James Walsh, please. Tell him it's Martha Reynolds." A brief hold, then a familiar voice, older but still instantly recognizable. Martha? Is that really you? Hello, James. It's time to open Thomas's envelope. A momentary silence. The sealed instructions? Martha, he made me promise those were only for a situation where the property is under threat, I finished. That's exactly what's happened. My son-in-law has changed the locks and declared that my daughter and I no longer have rights to our home. James's tone shifted immediately from friendly to professional. I'll retrieve the documents from the safe. Where can I reach you in an hour? I gave him Elaine's hospital information and hung up, my hand only slightly trembling. Thomas had been gone 5 years, but his foresight was about to become our salvation. My quiet, thoughtful husband, who could spot a storm brewing long before the clouds appeared, had prepared for this exact scenario. Derek never understood who he was dealing with, I murmured to myself. My son-in-law saw only what he wanted to see. An aging widow, too sentimental about an old farmhouse, too accommodating of a daughter who'd fled back home after her graphic design business in the city faltered. He looked at our weathered 2-story farmhouse, the ancient barn with its fading red paint, the 180 acres of woods and pasture, and saw dollar signs. Developers had been sniffing around our county for years, buying up family farms for vacation communities and luxury hunting lodges. What Derek didn't see, what Thomas had carefully ensured no one would see without deliberate investigation, was the complex legal structure that protected our land and assets. My husband hadn't merely been a country lawyer handling wills and property disputes for neighbors. He'd studied at Harvard, specialized in trusts and estates, and returned home to protect rural families from precisely the kind of predatory actions my son-in-law was now attempting. My phone rang again. James Walsh, right on schedule. Martha, I've opened the envelope. Thomas left detailed instructions and all the necessary documentation. His voice held a note of admiration. I've never seen a more comprehensive contingency plan. He really thought of everything. That was Thomas. Pride mingled with grief in my chest. What do we do first? I'm filing emergency injunctions tonight. Then first thing tomorrow, I'll send certified letters to every address associated with the property. A pause. Martha, did you know about the second property? The one in Wyoming? I smiled at Elaine, who was watching me with knowing eyes. Of course, James. Who do you think helped Thomas pick it out? And the mineral rights leases? The timber company shares? All part of our retirement plan. Derek just forced us to accelerate the timeline. After finishing with James, I called Sarah at the motel. Her voice sounded stronger already. The simple security of warm shelter working wonders. Mom, this room is full of filing cabinets, and there's a safe, and documents everywhere. What is all this? That's your father's backup office. The beginning of our response. I settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair, prepared for a long night. Now, listen carefully, honey. Tomorrow, your father's law partner is sending a very special letter to Derek. But before it arrives, I need you to do exactly as I say. As I outlined the first phase of Thomas's plan to our daughter, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. Derek thought he'd won by changing a few locks. He had no idea what was coming. Just tell me one thing, Mom, Sarah said as our call wound down. Are we going to get our home back? Oh, sweetheart, I replied, the first hint of satisfaction warming my voice. We're going to get so much more than that. 3 days can stretch like an eternity when you're plotting justice. I spent them divided between Elaine's hospital room and the cramped visitors' lounge, my phone pressed to my ear as I executed Thomas's long-dormant contingency plan. James Walsh, my husband's former law partner and executor of his more complicated arrangements, proved as meticulous as I remembered, methodically activating legal mechanisms Thomas had established years ago, designed specifically to protect our property from the very situation unfolding. The certified letters will arrive today, James confirmed during our third morning call. Sheriff Wilson will deliver the primary notice personally. And he understands the situation? I asked, pacing the small lounge as early sunlight streamed through dusty blinds. I've known John Wilson since he was a deputy. He's taking this very personally. Says your husband helped his family keep their orchard during the drought of '98. He'll handle it with the appropriate gravity. I smiled at the careful phrasing. Small communities have long memories, and the Wilson family wasn't the only one Thomas had helped navigate difficult times. My husband had charged minimal fees to local farmers facing bank foreclosures, often accepting payment in firewood or fresh produce when cash was tight. Derek, with his slick city ambitions and dismissive attitude toward country folk, had never bothered to understand the complex web of relationships that defined rural life. "Sarah's in position?" James asked. "Yes, she'll be watching from the Peterson place." The general store sat on a rise that offered a distant but clear view of our farmhouse's main drive. Mr. Peterson, whose grocery tab Thomas had quietly covered during his wife's cancer treatments, had given Sarah use of his upstairs apartment and a pair of binoculars for the occasion. "Perfect. And Martha," James hesitated, "are you sure you don't want to be there? You have every legal right to return to the property immediately." "No," I said firmly. "I want Derek to receive that letter without me present. I want him to have time to understand exactly what's happening before I return." What I didn't add was that I needed these days of preparation to master my anger, to transform white-hot fury into the cold, calculated response Thomas would have advised. My husband had always counseled his clients that revenge was poor motivation for legal action. Justice, protection, and rightful restoration were sturdier foundations. "Keep me posted," I told James before ending the call. "I want to know the moment the letter is delivered." By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Sheriff's car just turned onto our road. It's happening." I imagined the scene unfolding at our farmhouse. Sheriff Wilson's cruiser crunching up the gravel driveway, Derek's momentary confusion giving way to defensive hostility, the certified letter changing hands. The document itself was deceptively simple, just 3 pages of legal language that would systematically dismantle my son-in-law's premature victory celebration. Sarah's updates arrived in quick succession. Sheriff stayed for 20 minutes. Derek was gesturing a lot. Derek's parents just came outside. They look upset. Derek is on his phone now, pacing the porch. His dad just got in their car and left, driving fast. I shared these dispatches with Elaine, who had insisted on being kept informed despite her doctor's orders to avoid stress. My sister listened with undisguised satisfaction, occasionally offering colorful commentary about Derek's probable mental state. "Wish I could see his face," she said, adjusting her position against the hospital pillows with a wince. "Bet it's that same look Ralph Emerson had when the judge told him he couldn't dump his pig waste in the creek anymore. Like someone just told him the world isn't actually arranged for his convenience." "There will be plenty of time to observe his discomfort," I assured her. Though privately, I wondered if Derek would simply cut his losses and disappear once he understood the full scope of his situation. Part of me hoped he would. It would simplify matters considerably. But another part, the part that remembered Sarah standing in the rain for 6 hours while her husband watched from behind locked doors, wanted to witness his complete comprehension of his failure. Around dinner time, James called. "Letter delivered and received," he confirmed. "Sheriff Wilson says your son-in-law turned, and I quote, the color of church paper when he got to page 2. Has he attempted to contact you?" "Not yet, but I expect he'll try once the initial shock wears off. His father made some calls to real estate attorneys in Springfield, but they'll just confirm what our letter stated." I nodded, though James couldn't see me. Page 2 contained the most devastating revelation. The Reynolds family farm wasn't owned solely by me, as Derek had assumed. Thomas had placed it in an irrevocable family trust 15 years ago, with complex provisions that made it virtually impossible to sell without unanimous agreement from all trustees, myself, Sarah, and the trust's legal administrator, James Walsh. "What about the developers?" I asked. Thomas and I had been fielding increasingly aggressive offers for years from Clearwater Resorts, a company buying up rural properties throughout the Ozarks. "Interesting timing on that front," James replied. "I received a call from their legal department an hour ago. Apparently they've been in negotiations with Derek for several weeks. They were under the impression he had authority to sell." A cold weight settled in my stomach. He was planning to sell our home without even telling Sarah? The preliminary agreement he signed specified 50 acres initially, with an option for the remaining land once the elderly mother-in-law situation was resolved. I closed my eyes, absorbing this final betrayal. Not just stealing our home, but erasing our family's century-old connection to the land, the gardens where I'd taught Sarah to plant sunflowers, the oak grove where Thomas's ashes were scattered, the meadow where 3 generations of Reynolds children had learned to ride horses. Their legal team is understandably concerned now that they've learned about the trust, James continued. I made it clear that any agreements signed by Derek are completely invalid. Good. I took a steadying breath. Has he tried contacting Sarah? Multiple texts and calls, according to her last update. She's following our advice and maintaining complete silence. This had been the hardest part of our plan for Sarah to accept, the instruction to ignore any communication from Derek, no matter how desperate or apologetic. My daughter's compassionate nature made her vulnerable to manipulation, a quality Derek had exploited throughout their marriage. "Keep the pressure on," I said. "I'll be back in town tomorrow evening." After ending the call, I sat silently by Elaine's bedside, watching shadows lengthen across the hospital room. My sister had fallen asleep, her face finally peaceful after weeks of pain. The physical therapist had been cautiously optimistic that morning. With continued treatment and support, Elaine would likely regain most of her mobility. She wouldn't need my care for much longer. My phone buzzed with a final update from Sarah. "Derek just got in his truck and left. His parents are still here. What should I do?" "Nothing," I replied. "Stay where you are. Everything is proceeding exactly as your father anticipated." I put down my phone and opened the small leather journal I'd been keeping since Thomas's death. On a fresh page, I wrote, "Day 3, letter delivered. The board is set." Thomas had been an avid chess player, always thinking several moves ahead. In the final months of his illness, as lung cancer steadily claimed him, we'd spent countless evenings reviewing his preparations for various scenarios that might threaten our family's security. He'd been particularly concerned about Derek, whose financial desperation and sense of entitlement had grown increasingly apparent. "Men like him see the world as a series of transactions," Thomas had observed during one of our planning sessions. "He views our home as an underutilized asset, not the repository of our family's history and future." "What if he tries something after you're gone?" I'd asked. Thomas had smiled then, that quiet, confident smile that had first drawn me to him 50 years ago at a county fair pie contest. "Then he'll discover that a Reynolds never plays a game they haven't already figured out how to win." As evening settled over the hospital, I closed my journal and prepared for one more night away from home. Tomorrow I would return to the farm, not as the displaced victim Derek believed me to be, but as the executor of a reckoning he couldn't begin to imagine. The familiar rhythm of tires on gravel announced my return home after 97 days away. James had offered to drive me from the airport, but I'd insisted on renting a car. This homecoming needed to be on my terms, with no audience besides the one I'd chosen. Sarah waited at the end of our long driveway, her slender figure silhouetted against the setting sun. When I pulled alongside her battered Honda, still inoperable where Derek had left it after refusing to help with repairs, she slipped into my passenger seat without a word. "Are they inside?" I asked, nodding toward the farmhouse visible through the trees. "Just his parents now. Derek hasn't come back since he got the letter." Sarah's voice was steady, though shadows under her eyes revealed the toll of these days. "He's been calling non-stop, alternating between threats and apologies." I squeezed her hand briefly, then continued up the drive, the car's headlights sweeping across the weathered facade of our 2-story farmhouse. Thomas and I had painted it white with green trim the year after we married, and though the paint had been refreshed many times in the intervening decades, we'd kept the same colors, a visual testament to continuity in a world of constant change. Lights blazed from every downstairs window, an unnecessary waste of electricity that immediately irritated me. Derek's parents had never shown any regard for our household economies, treating our home like a hotel during their increasingly frequent visits. "Ready?" I asked, as I parked beside their luxury SUV. Sarah nodded, a hint of her father's resolve showing in the set of her jaw. More than ready. We didn't knock. The oak front door, installed by Thomas's grandfather in 1938, had been in our family far longer than the Prescotts had been in our lives. I used my key, which still worked despite Derek's threats, suggesting he'd only changed the locks on the back entrance Sarah typically used. Voices from the kitchen fell silent as we stepped into the front hallway. My boots echoed on the hardwood floors Thomas had restored by hand during our first year of marriage. "Hello, Diane." "Hello, Robert." I pitched my voice to Carrie as Sarah and I moved through the dining room. "I believe you're sitting in my kitchen." They froze like guilty children when we appeared in the doorway. Diane Prescott with a glass of my blackberry wine halfway to her lips. Robert with a plate of what appeared to be the last of the honey-baked ham I'd left in the freezer before departing. "Martha." Diane recovered first, setting down her glass with affected casualness. "We weren't expecting you back so soon." "How's your sister?" "Improving. Thank you for asking." I set my purse on the counter and surveyed the kitchen, noticeably messier than the immaculate space I'd left behind. Though I'm surprised you'd inquire, given that you and Robert have decided Sarah and I don't live here anymore. Robert Prescott shifted uncomfortably, his florid face betraying embarrassment his wife seemed immune to. Now, Martha, there's been a misunderstanding. Derek was upset. You know how young people can overreact. Is that what you call changing locks and leaving your daughter-in-law in the rain for 6 hours? I kept my tone conversational as I opened the refrigerator, noting with disapproval how little remained of the carefully prepared meals I'd stocked before leaving. A misunderstanding? She could have gone to a neighbor's, Diane said dismissively, reaching for her wine again. It wasn't our responsibility to— Our closest neighbor is 4 miles away, as you well know, I interrupted. And responsibility is precisely what I'd like to discuss. I took 2 crystal glasses from the cabinet, wedding gifts from Thomas's mother, and poured ice water for Sarah and myself. The deliberate domesticity of the gesture seemed to unnerve the Prescotts further. We understand Derek's received some sort of legal notice, Robert ventured, clearly attempting to redirect the conversation. Yes, a courtesy explanation of the property's actual ownership structure. I sat at the head of the table, Thomas's old place, which Robert had apparently claimed during my absence. He shifted awkwardly to an adjacent seat without being asked. I believe it clarified certain misconceptions. Ridiculous legal mumbo-jumbo, Diane declared with forced confidence. Derek's consulting with attorneys who assure him that document won't hold up in court. You can't just change property ownership retroactively with some trust. I smiled, the expression not reaching my eyes. The Reynolds Family Trust was established 15 years ago, Diane. There's nothing retroactive about it. Your son's claim that he had any right to evict us was, however, entirely fabricated. Where is Derek? Sarah asked, speaking for the first time since we'd entered. He should be part of this conversation. Robert and Diane exchanged glances laden with unspoken communication. He's staying with friends in Springfield, Robert finally offered, consulting with legal experts about this situation. Interesting, I remarked, because Sheriff Wilson mentioned seeing him checking into the Bluebird Motel just outside town this morning. Another telling glance between the Prescotts. I'd struck a nerve, confirming my suspicion that Derek had abandoned his parents to deal with the aftermath of his actions, a pattern Sarah had described throughout their marriage. Well, we'll be joining him shortly, Diane announced, gathering her purse with exaggerated dignity. We certainly don't feel welcome here anymore. That's entirely your choice, I said calmly. Though I should mention that Sheriff Wilson will be returning tomorrow to inventory the property, given the unauthorized removal of Sarah's possessions. This stopped Diane mid-rise. What unauthorized removal? My clothes, my laptop, Dad's watch that Mom gave me on our wedding day? Sarah listed flatly. All missing from my room. Derek may have packed some things, Robert admitted reluctantly, for safekeeping. Theft is the legal term, I believe, I corrected, but we're giving him the opportunity to return everything before pressing charges. Diane's face flushed an unattractive shade of crimson. Pressing charges? Against your own son-in-law? After everything he's done for this family? The laugh that escaped me held no humor. What exactly has Derek done for us, Diane? Besides attempting to steal our home and sell it to developers while refusing to even fix his wife's car? Robert's head snapped up. Developers? What are you talking about? Clearwater Resorts, Sarah supplied, her voice tight with controlled anger. He's been negotiating with them for weeks. Signed a preliminary agreement to sell 50 acres initially, with options for the rest once Mom was dealt with. That's not— He wouldn't, Robert stammered, looking to his wife for confirmation or denial. Diane's pinched expression told me she'd known about these plans, even if her husband hadn't. The property is underutilized, she declared defensively. Derek was exploring options to maximize its potential. That's just good business sense. By selling land he didn't own without consulting his wife or me? I kept my voice level with effort. That's not business, Diane. That's fraud. You always were unreasonably attached to this old place, she sniffed. It's falling apart. The roof needs replacing. That ancient barn is a liability. The smart move would be selling to developers before property values drop again. Then it's fortunate the decision isn't yours to make. I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. Now, I've had a long journey, and Sarah and I would like to settle back into our home. You have until noon tomorrow to remove your belongings. You can't just throw us out, Diane protested. Actually, I can. This is my property. I fixed her with a steady gaze. But unlike your son, I'm giving you a reasonable time frame and the dignity of packing your own things. The Prescotts departed in a flurry of muttered threats and slammed doors, their SUV spraying gravel as Robert accelerated down the driveway. When the sound of their engine faded, Sarah and I stood in the sudden silence of our reclaimed kitchen. "They'll be back with Derek," Sarah warned, "and he'll be worse than ever. I'm counting on it." I opened a drawer and removed the list I'd made 3 days earlier during one of my midnight planning sessions. But first, we have work to do. We spent that evening reclaiming our space, changing sheets, airing rooms, disposing of evidence of the Prescotts' occupation. In Sarah's room, dresser drawers stood empty, her closet stripped of everything except items Derek had deemed worthless. The space where her laptop had been, containing 5 years of freelance graphic design work, was a conspicuous void on her desk. "We'll get everything back," I assured her, helping to remake her bed with fresh linens. "Your father's plan is still unfolding." Sarah paused, smoothing the quilt I'd made for her high school graduation. "Mom, what exactly did Dad arrange? James mentioned a trust, but there seems to be more going on." I sat on the edge of her freshly made bed, patting the space beside me. "There's much more. The letter was just the opening move. Tomorrow we play the middle game." As I outlined the next phase of Thomas's carefully constructed strategy, Sarah's eyes widened with growing understanding. By the time I finished, her expression had transformed from wounded vulnerability to something approaching her father's strategic resolve. "Derek has no idea what's coming, does he?" she asked softly. "None whatsoever," I confirmed. "He's playing checkers while your father set up chess." That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in more than 3 months, surrounded by the familiar contours and scents of the room Thomas and I had shared for 47 years. His absence remained a physical ache, but I drew strength from the knowledge that his protection extended beyond death, a final gift of security for the family he'd cherished. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, but tonight was for restoration. For the first time since receiving Sarah's desperate call, I slept deeply and without interruption, dreamless and at peace in the home that had never stopped being ours. Sheriff John Wilson arrived at precisely 9:01 a.m., his cruiser rolling up our driveway with the punctuality that had defined his 27 years in law enforcement. A second vehicle followed, a county SUV containing 2 deputies and James Walsh, my husband's former law partner and the trust's legal administrator. I greeted them on the porch with coffee and the cinnamon rolls Sarah had stress-baked before dawn. John Wilson removed his hat as he approached, a gesture of respect that had become increasingly rare in younger generations. "Martha," he nodded, accepting a steaming mug. "Good to have you home. Place hasn't been the same without you." "Thank you for coming, Sheriff." I handed James his coffee, black with 1 sugar, just as he'd taken it during the countless strategy sessions with Thomas over the years. "I appreciate the official presence for this inventory." "Least I could do," John replied, his weathered face solemn. "Your husband kept the Wilsons on our land when that bank tried to call our loan." "Never forgot that." James sipped his coffee with appreciation before getting down to business. "The deputies will document any missing or damaged property. Standard procedure. Completely by the book. We want an unimpeachable record." We moved through the house methodically, room by room. The deputies photographed empty spaces where Sarah's possessions should have been, recording her descriptions of each missing item: clothes, jewelry, electronics, and, most painfully, the vintage pocket watch that had been Thomas's grandfather's, which I'd given to Sarah on her wedding day. "He knew how much that meant to me," Sarah said quietly, as Deputy Morales noted the watch's description and approximate value. "It was the last thing I'd expect him to take. Sometimes people take what will cause the most pain, not what's worth the most money," I observed, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Your father understood that kind of vindictiveness all too well." In Thomas's study, a room I'd kept largely unchanged since his death, we discovered additional evidence of Derek's violations. The antique desk drawers had been forced open, papers scattered and rifled through, though the wall safe behind Thomas's law degrees remained untouched, its existence apparently undiscovered. "Looking for property deeds, most likely," James observed, examining the damaged desk. "Typical amateur move, assuming important documents would be kept in an obvious location." Sheriff Wilson shook his head in disgust. "Breaking into a former county judge's private papers. Your son-in-law's digging himself quite a hole, Martha." Thomas had never officially held the title of judge, having served only as a temporary appointee during a colleague's extended illness, but the community had continued using the honorific long after he returned to private practice. It was one of many details about our family's standing in the community that Derek had never bothered to understand. The inventory took most of the morning, each documented violation adding to the legal case building against my son-in-law. By noon, the deputies had filled several forms with meticulous descriptions of missing items and property damage. "We're still documenting the outbuildings and land," Sheriff Wilson reported as we reconvened on the porch for lunch. Simple sandwiches and lemonade Sarah had prepared. "But there's clear evidence of trespassing in the north pasture. Surveyor stakes, marking tape on trees. Clearwater's preliminary work," James confirmed grimly. "They typically survey potential properties before finalizing purchase agreements. Your son-in-law appears to have given them access without any legal authority to do so." I absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally, each new revelation of Derek's presumption fueled my resolve. The north pasture contained the family cemetery where 5 generations of Reynolds rested, including Thomas. The thought of developers' stakes marking boundaries through that sacred ground sent a cold anger through me that no visible emotion could adequately express. "Add it to the report," I said simply. "Every unauthorized action needs to be documented." As the deputies resumed their work, James drew me aside, speaking quietly to avoid being overheard by Sarah, who was showing Sheriff Wilson the damage to the barn doors. "I received a call this morning from Derek's newly retained attorney," he informed me. "Gregory Parker from Springfield. He's requesting a meeting to resolve this unfortunate family misunderstanding amicably." Parker. I recognized the name from Thomas's occasional professional complaints. Isn't he the one Thomas called an ambulance chaser with delusions of adequacy? James's lips twitched in a suppressed smile. "The very same. Specializes in quick settlements, typically representing the party with weaker legal standing. He's requesting the meeting take place at his office in Springfield." "I imagine he is," I replied dryly. "And how did you respond?" I informed him that as administrator of the Reynolds Family Trust, I'd be happy to meet at our local courthouse with all relevant documentation present. I also mentioned that Sheriff Wilson would be delivering a formal trespassing notice to Clearwater Resorts this afternoon, informing them that any preliminary agreements with Derek Prescott are null and void. I nodded approval. Perfect. What was Parker's response? He became considerably less interested in an amicable resolution and more focused on threatening countersuits for defamation and emotional distress. James looked almost amused. I suggested he review the certified letter we sent before making threats he can't substantiate. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel, a vehicle approaching far too quickly for our rural driveway. Sarah tensed visibly as Derek's black pickup truck came into view, dust billowing behind it. "Right on schedule," I noted, checking my watch. The Prescott's noon deadline had passed exactly 7 minutes earlier. Sheriff Wilson moved to stand beside me, his presence both reassuring and official. James positioned himself on my other side, legal notepad in hand, while the deputies paused in their documentation to observe the unfolding scene. Derek slammed his truck door with unnecessary force as he emerged, his face flushed with anger or exertion or both. He'd clearly dressed to intimidate. Expensive boots, pressed jeans, a sport coat that seemed absurdly formal for a rural confrontation. The effect was somewhat undermined by his obvious lack of sleep, stubbled jaw, and the wild look in his eyes as he registered the law enforcement presence. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, stomping toward us before halting abruptly as Sheriff Wilson raised a hand. "Mr. Prescott," the sheriff acknowledged coolly. "Perfect timing. We're conducting an official inventory of missing and damaged property. Perhaps you can assist by telling us the whereabouts of your wife's possessions?" Derek's gaze darted between the uniformed officers, James's professional demeanor, and finally to Sarah and me, standing calmly on our own porch. Whatever scenario he'd envisioned when racing here clearly hadn't included this assemblage of witnesses. You can't just," he sputtered, his rehearsed aggression faltering. "I need to speak with my wife, privately." "Ex-wife, technically," Sarah corrected, her voice steadier than I'd expected. "The divorce papers were delivered to your motel this morning. Given your public statement that we don't live here anymore, I assumed our marriage had similarly concluded." Derek's expression shifted from angry to calculating. Sarah, honey, that was a misunderstanding. I was upset, not thinking clearly. You know I didn't mean it that way. Actually, James interjected, consulting his notepad with theatrical precision. According to the sworn statements of witnesses at the general store, you specifically stated, and I quote, "We've had a family meeting and decided you and your mother don't belong here anymore. Get your stuff and get out." Would you like to amend that statement now, under oath? The blood drained from Derek's face as he realized the extent of the documentation arrayed against him. His gaze hardened as it fixed on me. "This is your doing," he accused. "You never wanted Sarah to marry me. You've been waiting for a chance to turn her against me." "Derek," I replied evenly, "I haven't had to do anything except document your own actions. Now perhaps you could tell Sheriff Wilson where to find Sarah's laptop. Her client files represent significant financial and intellectual property. And my father's watch," Sarah added, her voice catching slightly despite her composed exterior. A flicker of something ugly crossed Derek's face, satisfaction at the pain he'd caused, quickly masked by manufactured confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't take anything." Sheriff Wilson sighed heavily. "Mr. Prescott, we have photographs of empty drawers, closets, and storage spaces. Multiple witnesses saw you removing boxes and suitcases from this residence 3 days ago. Lying to law enforcement officers conducting an official investigation is inadvisable." Derek's facade cracked further as he realized the extent of the trap closing around him. His gaze darted toward his truck, as if contemplating retreat. "Don't even think about it," Sheriff Wilson warned mildly. "Evading questioning would only complicate your situation." For a moment, I almost pitied my son-in-law. He'd walked into this confrontation expecting to find 2 vulnerable women he could intimidate back into compliance with his plans. Instead, he faced the full weight of legal documentation, law enforcement presence, and most devastatingly, the calm certainty in his wife's eyes that their marriage was truly over. "Perhaps," I suggested into the tense silence, "you should start by explaining your conversations with Clearwater Resorts about property you don't own." Derek's expression confirmed that our knowledge of his development dealings represented yet another unanticipated setback. In that moment of realization, I saw what Thomas had recognized years ago, the essential hollowness beneath Derek's confident exterior, the desperate scrambling of a man whose sense of entitlement had finally collided with immovable reality. "I think," Sheriff Wilson said, removing handcuffs from his belt with deliberate slowness, "we should continue this conversation down at the station. Mr. Prescott, you're not under arrest at this time, but I'm formally requesting you accompany me to answer questions regarding missing property and potential fraud." As Derek was escorted to the sheriff's cruiser, not in handcuffs, but with the clear understanding that cooperation was his only viable option, Sarah moved to stand beside me on the porch. We watched in silence as the vehicles departed down our driveway, leaving us alone in the afternoon quiet. "Is this what Dad planned?" she asked softly. "All of it?" "The general strategy," I confirmed, though even Thomas couldn't have anticipated every detail of Derek's self-destruction. Sarah leaned against the porch railing, her expression pensive. "I feel like I should be more upset. My marriage is over. My work is missing. Everything's changed in a week." I slipped my arm around her shoulders, feeling the subtle trembling she was working hard to control. "Some endings are also beginnings, sweetheart. Your father understood that better than most." Together, we stood on the porch of the home that had never stopped being ours, watching dust settle on the driveway as the middle phase of Thomas's carefully orchestrated plan played out exactly as he had envisioned years before. The following morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect early autumn day that seemed deliberately designed to contrast with the emotional storms of the previous week. Sarah and I settled into a tentative routine, reclaiming our spaces and rhythms after the disruption of the Prescott's occupation. Though many of her belongings remained missing, Derek had maintained his ignorance during questioning at the sheriff's office, despite mounting evidence of his deception. There was comfort in simply being home, in territory that was unquestionably ours. After breakfast, I led Sarah to Thomas's study, a room she'd rarely entered since his death. The space remained much as he'd left it, bookshelves lined with legal texts and local histories, the worn leather chair where he'd spent countless evenings reviewing cases, the wall of family photographs chronicling generations of Reynolds' history. "It still smells like him," Sarah observed quietly, running her fingers along the edge of his desk. Pipe tobacco and that cedar cologne he always used. I nodded, moving to the wall behind his desk where his framed law degree and bar admission hung slightly askew after Derek's intrusion. Carefully, I removed both frames, revealing the wall safe they had concealed. A simple but effective hiding place that had apparently escaped my son-in-law's notice. "Dad had a safe here all this time?" Sarah asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Your father had several secure locations throughout the property," I explained, turning the dial with practiced precision. He believed in redundancy when it came to protecting important matters. The safe opened with a satisfying click, revealing a stack of document folders and a smaller metal box. I removed everything, placing them on Thomas's desk with ceremonial care. "These contain the next phase of your father's plan," I told Sarah. "The pieces he set in motion years ago, anticipating a moment exactly like this one." "You keep talking about Dad's plan like it's some kind of elaborate chess strategy," Sarah said, eyeing the folders with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What exactly did he arrange?" I sorted through the folders, selecting one labeled Secondary Property, and placed it before her. "Open it," I encouraged. "See for yourself." Inside were photographs of a property I knew well, but Sarah had never seen. A sprawling ranch house nestled against a backdrop of Wyoming mountains, surrounded by acres of pristine grassland and aspen groves. "What is this place?" she asked, examining the images with growing confusion. "The Reynolds Ranch," I replied, allowing a hint of satisfaction to color my tone. 2,000 acres outside Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Purchased 20 years ago through a separate family LLC that Thomas established. Sarah looked up sharply. "We own this? All of it?" "We do, along with the mineral rights to another 3,000 adjacent acres, which have been leased to a conservation trust for the past 15 years, generating quarterly income that's been reinvested through the trust." Her expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. That's what James meant about the mineral rights. But why didn't I know about any of this? I sat in Thomas's chair, the familiar leather creaking beneath me. "Your father believed in protecting assets through separation and discretion. The fewer people who know about significant holdings, the less vulnerable those holdings become." "Even from family?" There was a hint of hurt in her question. "Especially from family connections we couldn't control," I clarified gently. "Thomas had concerns about Derek's financial judgment from the beginning of your relationship. He saw patterns that worried him." Sarah's shoulders slumped slightly. "Dad never trusted Derek, did he?" "Trust is earned, not automatically granted," I replied carefully. "Your father wanted to be proven wrong about Derek. Unfortunately, recent events have only confirmed his initial assessment." I selected another folder from the stack, this one labeled Timber Holdings. Inside were quarterly statements from Western Sustainable Forestry Inc., documenting dividend payments and growth projections for a substantial investment Thomas had made in the early 1990s. "Your father diversified our assets carefully," I explained, as Sarah reviewed the statements with widening eyes. "The farm was never our only resource, just the most visible one. He established multiple income streams, protected through various legal structures, ensuring we would never be vulnerable to a single financial threat." "Like Derek trying to sell the farm," Sarah murmured, understanding dawning in her expression. "Precisely." I opened the metal box next, revealing several flash drives, a small notebook in Thomas's precise handwriting, and a sealed envelope with Sarah's name. These contain the complete documentation of all Reynolds family holdings, investments, and legal protections, including, I added with deliberate emphasis, the deed to a small property in Springfield that Thomas purchased 10 years ago as a potential law office location. Sarah frowned slightly. "Springfield? What does that have to do with—" She stopped abruptly, the connection forming in her mind. "The Bluebird Motel, where Derek's staying, is directly adjacent to that property," I confirmed, "which means every time Sheriff Wilson visits Derek with another question or document, he's legally on Reynolds' land, a fact Thomas would have appreciated for both practical and poetic reasons." A smile ghosted across Sarah's face, the first genuine one I'd seen since my return. "Dad thought of everything, didn't he?" "He tried," I acknowledged, handing her the sealed envelope. "This is specifically for you. He prepared it during his final months, when we discussed various scenarios that might unfold after his death." Sarah accepted the envelope with visible trepidation, turning it over in her hands several times before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of Thomas's stationery, covered in his distinctive handwriting, increasingly shaky toward the end as his illness had progressed, but still unmistakably his. I remained silent as she read, watching emotions play across her face: surprise, grief, determination, and finally, a quiet resolve that reminded me powerfully of Thomas himself. "He knew," she said softly, looking up from the letter with tears threatening, "about Derek's character, about the potential threat. He saw it all coming years ago." "Your father was an exceptional judge of character," I confirmed, "both in his professional capacity and his personal assessments. He says I'm to take charge of the Wyoming property," Sarah continued, her voice strengthening, "that it's my inheritance, separate from the farm, established specifically to ensure I would always have security and independence regardless of," she faltered slightly, "regardless of the success or failure of my marriage." "Thomas believed in preparation, not pessimism," I clarified. "He hoped for the best outcome for your marriage while ensuring protection against the worst." Sarah refolded the letter carefully, her expression thoughtful. "The property has a guest house. He says it's where you and he stayed whenever you visited. That it would be perfect for," her voice caught, "perfect for my mother in her later years, should she choose to remain independent while still being close to family." The familiar ache of missing Thomas intensified at this evidence of his meticulous concern for both our futures. Even facing his own mortality, his thoughts had been focused on ensuring our security and happiness long after he was gone. "Your father understood the importance of choices," I said, "of having options beyond the obvious or immediate. Like the option of starting over in Wyoming," Sarah mused, the idea clearly taking root in her imagination. "Away from Derek, away from the memories of his betrayal." "If that's what you want," I agreed, "though there's no rush to decide. The immediate priority is resolving the situation here." Sarah nodded, her expression shifting towards something more determined. "Which brings us back to Derek and his parents. They're not going to simply accept defeat and disappear, are they?" "No," I acknowledged. "The Prescotts strike me as people who escalate rather than retreat when confronted with their own failures. We should expect their next move to be more aggressive." "What would Dad do?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the documents spread before us. "What's the next phase of his plan?" I gathered the folders together, returning them to the safe except for the Wyoming property documentation, which I left for Sarah to examine more thoroughly. "Your father's strategy was never about retribution for its own sake. It was about protection first, then resolution that served justice while preserving our dignity." "That sounds like Dad," Sarah agreed with a small smile. "Always taking the high road." "The high road, yes, but with very clear boundaries." I closed the safe, replacing the frames that concealed it. "The next phase isn't about waiting for their move, but consolidating our position so thoroughly that they have no choice but to accept reality." "And how do we do that?" I checked my watch, nearly time for my scheduled call with James to discuss precisely this question. "By completing the inventory of our assets, filing formal charges regarding the missing property, and most importantly, making it abundantly clear to Derek and his parents that any further attempts to threaten our home will only expose them to increased legal consequences." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression resolute. "They need to understand that we're not victims they can intimidate. We're Reynolds women protecting what's rightfully ours." "Exactly," I agreed, feeling a surge of pride at her growing confidence. "And thanks to your father's foresight, we have resources they can't begin to imagine." As I left Thomas's study to prepare for the call with James, I paused in the doorway, watching Sarah open the Wyoming folder again, examining the photographs of the property that represented her separate inheritance and potential future. The mixture of grief and determination in her expression mirrored what I'd felt in those first terrible months after Thomas's death. The painful recognition that life had irreversibly changed, coupled with the resolute decision to move forward along the path he'd helped prepare. My daughter was finding her strength again, rebuilding from the foundation Thomas had established for her. Whatever came next, whether Derek's desperate counterattacks or the Prescotts' attempts at intimidation, we would face it together, guided by Thomas's wisdom and protected by his meticulous planning. The best revenge, as my husband often noted during his legal career, was not emotional satisfaction, but complete, irrefutable vindication. And thanks to Thomas, that vindication was now merely a matter of time and execution. The Prescott's response came sooner than expected, though precisely in the form Thomas had anticipated. 3 days after Derek's questioning at the sheriff's office, a courier delivered a thick envelope containing a formal letter from Gregory Parker, Derek's attorney, outlining a series of counter-accusations and demands that bordered on the absurd. Emotional distress, alienation of affection, fraudulent misrepresentation of property ownership, James read aloud, his tone conveying professional disdain as we sat at my kitchen table reviewing the document. And my personal favorite, punitive damages for loss of future business opportunity and consequential damages related to the Clearwater Resorts development project. Sarah, who had been preparing lunch nearby, gave a disbelieving laugh. He's suing us for preventing him from selling property he doesn't own? Essentially, yes. James set the letter aside with the careful handling one might use for something contaminated. It's a desperation tactic. Parker knows he has no legitimate case, but he's hoping to intimidate you into a settlement. How much are they demanding? I asked, though the specific number mattered little. The principle was what concerned me. $2 million, James replied, his expression making clear how seriously he took this figure. Plus, full rights to the North Pasture property, specifically the 50 acres Derek had already promised to Clearwater. My jaw tightened involuntarily. The North Pasture contained not only our family cemetery, but the natural spring that provided water to much of our property. Surrendering it would effectively cripple the farm's operations while desecrating our most sacred family ground. That's not even remotely possible, I said flatly. Of course not, James agreed. The demand isn't meant to be reasonable. It's meant to frighten you into making some lesser concession, perhaps a cash settlement, to make this go away. Sarah set a plate of sandwiches on the table, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the anger I could see building behind her eyes. He really believes he can threaten and bully his way into getting paid off, doesn't he? Derek has always confused aggression with strength, I observed, accepting a sandwich with a grateful nod to my daughter. A lesson he learned from his father, I suspect. James selected a sandwich for himself, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the personal nature of this case. I've prepared our formal response, he said, removing another document from his briefcase. A comprehensive refutation of their claims, coupled with our countersuit for the missing property, attempted fraud regarding the Clearwater negotiations, and malicious prosecution. I reviewed the document carefully. It was thorough, precisely worded, and left no room for misinterpretation. This seems appropriate, I approved, passing it to Sarah for her review. What do you anticipate their next move will be? James considered the question while chewing thoughtfully. Based on Parker's reputation, I expect a rapid escalation followed by an equally rapid retreat when he realizes the weakness of their position. He typically avoids actual courtroom confrontations, preferring to secure quick settlements through intimidation. And if intimidation fails? Sarah asked. Then he'll likely counsel Derek to cut his losses and walk away. James dabbed his mouth with a napkin. The challenge is that Derek strikes me as someone who may not accept such advice. His pride appears to be a significant factor in his decision-making. His pride and his parents' influence, I added. Diane Prescott seems particularly invested in this property. I suspect she's the one pushing for the North Pasture specifically. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple vehicles approaching, unusual for our isolated location. Sarah moved to the window, her posture tensing immediately. It's Derek, she reported, with his parents. And another car I don't recognize. James joined her at the window, his expression darkening. Gregory Parker, he identified. And it appears he's brought a photographer. This is unexpected. I remained seated, refusing to be rushed into defensive reactions. They're attempting to provoke a confrontation they can document for their lawsuit, I surmised, creating evidence of our supposed hostility. Precisely, James agreed. The standard approach would be to serve notice through official channels, not arrive en masse like this. They're hoping for an emotional reaction they can use against you. Through the window, I watched the small convoy park haphazardly in our yard. Derek's black pickup, his parents' luxury SUV, and Parker's sedan, with a younger man carrying a professional camera. The tableau had been carefully arranged for maximum intimidation, with Derek and his father in the lead as they approached our porch. What's our best response? Sarah asked, her voice admirably steady, despite the obvious anxiety this invasion provoked. Controlled civility, I advised, rising from the table with deliberate calm. They want a scene. We won't give them one. I moved to the front door, opening it before they could knock or, worse, pound dramatically for the benefit of the photographer now documenting their approach. Derek, Robert, Diane. I acknowledged each with a polite nod. And you must be Mr. Parker. This is certainly an unconventional approach to legal communication. Parker, a florid man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit, stepped forward with practiced confidence. Mrs. Reynolds, we're here to discuss the unreasonable position you've taken regarding my client's rightful interests in this property. Any discussion regarding legal matters should be directed to my attorney, I replied evenly, gesturing to James, who had positioned himself beside me. As I believe he's made clear in his communications with your office. We're not interested in more delays and legal maneuvering, Derek interjected, his tone aggressive, though he remained carefully positioned for the photographer's benefit. We're here to resolve this situation today. By bringing a photographer to our private property, Sarah joined me in the doorway, her expression calm, though I could sense her tension. That seems more like creating a spectacle than seeking resolution. Documentation purposes only, Parker assured us, with an oily smile. Given the unfortunate hostility that's characterized this family dispute, there is no dispute about property ownership, James stated firmly. The Reynolds family trust documentation is definitive and legally unassailable. If you've come hoping to intimidate my clients into concessions through this theatrical display, you're wasting everyone's time. Robert Prescott, who had been uncharacteristically silent, stepped forward. Look, we're reasonable people. We understand there's been some miscommunication. Derek may have overreacted by changing the locks. We acknowledge that was inappropriate. This unexpected concession caught me by surprise, though I maintained my neutral expression. Robert had always been the more pragmatic of the Prescotts, frequently playing mediator when Diane's ambitions or Derek's temper created conflicts. That's a start, I acknowledged cautiously, though it doesn't address the missing property or the unauthorized negotiations with Clearwater. We're prepared to return Sarah's personal items, Robert continued, glancing at his wife, who remained stone-faced. As a gesture of good faith, in exchange, we're asking for reasonable compensation for the improvements Derek has made to the property over the years. I almost laughed at the transparent attempt to reframe their position. What improvements would those be exactly? The damaged barn door? The unauthorized survey stakes in our family cemetery? I've invested thousands in this place, Derek countered hotly. New fencing on the east boundary. Repairs to the equipment shed, my time and labor maintaining land that benefits you far more than me. Maintenance is not improvement, James noted dryly. And as a resident of the property, Mr. Prescott was responsible for basic upkeep, regardless of ownership. The conversation was deteriorating exactly as the Prescotts had hoped, toward conflict they could document and potentially use in their legal maneuvering. I caught Sarah's eye, a silent reminder of our agreed strategy. Perhaps, she suggested with remarkable composure, we should focus on the immediate issue of my missing possessions. If you're genuinely offering to return them, that would indeed be a positive step toward de-escalation. Her reasonable tone seemed to momentarily confuse Derek, who had clearly prepared for confrontation rather than calm negotiation. Before he could respond, Diane stepped forward, her carefully maintained facade of sophistication slipping to reveal the calculating ambition beneath. Let's stop pretending this is about clothes and laptops, she said dismissively. This is about the future of this property. You're sitting on a gold mine with these acres, and you're too stubborn or sentimental to recognize it. Clearwater is prepared to pay millions. Millions that would benefit all of us, including you, Sarah. The property isn't for sale, I stated firmly. Not the north pasture, not any part of it. That's not negotiable. Everything's negotiable for the right price, Parker interjected smoothly. My clients are prepared to be generous in recognition of your emotional attachment to the homestead. The current offer would allow you to retain the main house and immediate grounds while unlocking the value of the undeveloped acreage. The photographer had begun circling wider, capturing images of the property rather than just our confrontation, documenting the undeveloped acreage whose value they were so eager to unlock. The violation of this intrusion, this assessment of our home as a commodity to be parceled and sold, fueled a cold anger I controlled with effort. "Mr. Parker," James intervened, his tone professionally crisp. "Your presence here with a photographer constitutes trespassing, as no permission was granted for this visit or documentation. I suggest you remove yourselves from Reynolds' property immediately, or Sheriff Wilson will be happy to provide escort." As if on cue, though it was actually the result of a call I'd placed upon first seeing the approaching vehicles, the distinctive sound of the sheriff's cruiser became audible on our long driveway. The arrival of law enforcement visibly unnerved Parker, whose confident demeanor faltered as he realized his theatrical approach had backfired. The Prescotts, however, showed no such concern, particularly Diane, whose expression had hardened into something approaching triumph despite the apparent setback. That expression, more than anything else that had occurred during their invasion, triggered a warning in my mind. Diane Prescott was not a woman who displayed satisfaction in the face of defeat unless she believed she held an advantage we hadn't yet recognized. As Sheriff Wilson's cruiser pulled alongside the cluster of vehicles in our yard, I found myself wondering what card Diane thought she still had to play, and how Thomas would have anticipated this particular move in their desperate chess game. Sheriff Wilson's arrival transformed the confrontation on our porch from aggressive legal theater to a rapidly deflating standoff. Gregory Parker, clearly uncomfortable with law enforcement presence interrupting his carefully staged scene, began a hasty retreat, instructing his photographer to cease documentation and return to their vehicle. "This is unnecessary," he protested as Sheriff Wilson approached with unhurried authority. "We were simply attempting to facilitate a family discussion." "With cameras and legal threats," James noted dryly. "An unusual approach to family reconciliation." Sheriff Wilson removed his hat respectfully as he joined us. Ms. Reynolds, received your call about unauthorized visitors." His gaze swept over the assembled Prescotts with professional detachment. "Folks, I believe we've already had a discussion about trespassing on this property." "We were invited," Derek claimed immediately, though his shifting posture betrayed the lie. "Is that so?" The sheriff turned to me with a raised eyebrow. "No invitation was extended," I confirmed calmly, "nor would one have been necessary if they had approached through proper legal channels rather than this theatrical display." Robert Prescott, ever the pragmatist when confrontations escalated beyond his comfort, placed a restraining hand on his son's arm. "We'll go," he said, attempting to salvage dignity from the situation. "But this matter isn't resolved. We have legitimate interests that—" "Any legitimate interests can be addressed through your attorney," James interrupted smoothly, "without photographers or unannounced property invasions." The Prescotts retreated with obvious reluctance, Parker following with visible relief at escaping further law enforcement interaction. Only Diane lingered momentarily, her gaze fixed on me with an expression of such calculated satisfaction that it renewed my earlier unease. "This isn't over, Martha," she said quietly, her voice pitched for my ears alone. "We still have an ace you don't know about. When it's played, you'll wish you'd taken our offer." Before I could respond, she turned and followed her husband to their SUV, her designer heels inappropriate for our gravel driveway, but worn with determined dignity nonetheless. Sheriff Wilson waited until all three vehicles had departed before turning to us with a more relaxed demeanor. "Figured you might need some official presence when I saw those vehicles turn onto your road," he explained. "Parker's developing quite a reputation for these confrontational approaches." "We appreciate the assistance, John," I acknowledged. "I'll file a report documenting this incident," he assured us. "Adds to the pattern we're establishing of harassment and attempted intimidation." After the sheriff departed, the three of us returned to the kitchen, the interrupted lunch forgotten as we processed this latest development. "Diane Prescott made a point of suggesting they have some unknown advantage," I informed James, relating her parting comment. "Something she believes will change our position." James frowned thoughtfully. "A bluff, most likely. The legal documentation is unassailable. Thomas saw to that." "Unless there's something we've overlooked," Sarah suggested, her expression troubled. "Some vulnerability Dad couldn't have anticipated." "Your father was extremely thorough," James assured her. "But it would be prudent to review everything again, particularly in light of Mrs. Prescott's confidence." We spent the remainder of the afternoon doing precisely that, examining trust documents, property records, and Thomas's meticulous notes for any potential weakness the Prescotts might exploit. Nothing emerged, only further confirmation of my husband's careful legal structuring to protect our family legacy. As evening approached, Sarah's phone rang. An unknown number she answered with cautious formality. Her expression shifted rapidly from wariness to shock as she listened to the caller. "It's at the Bluebird Motel," she said after ending the call, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Room 118. They found my laptop and Dad's watch." "Who found them?" I asked, immediately suspicious of convenient timing after the day's confrontation. "A housekeeper," Sarah explained. She recognized Dad's watch from a photo in a local newspaper article about his death a few years ago. Remembered he was a judge. She called the sheriff's office and they contacted me. James and I exchanged concerned glances. "This seems orchestrated," he observed carefully. "I need to go," Sarah insisted, already reaching for her keys. "That watch is all I have left of Dad." "Not alone," I countered firmly. "Not after today's display. James, would you mind accompanying us?" 20 minutes later, we pulled into the Bluebird Motel's parking lot, a modest establishment on the outskirts of town that had seen better days. Room 118 was located at the far end of the single-story structure, partially obscured by an ice machine and vending area. "Wait here," James instructed, his caution evident. "Let me verify the situation first." He approached the room and knocked firmly. After a brief exchange with someone inside, he motioned us forward with obvious reluctance. The housekeeper who greeted us was a young woman with nervous eyes and the air of someone participating in something she didn't fully understand. She explained in halting English how she'd discovered the watch and laptop while cleaning the recently vacated room. "Previous guest check out this morning," she told us, gesturing to the items placed on the room's desk. "Find these under bed. Remember Judge Face from newspaper when he died." Sarah moved immediately to examine the laptop, her professional machine containing years of design work and client files. The relief on her face as she confirmed it was indeed hers, quickly gave way to confusion. "This doesn't make sense," she said, opening the computer and powering it on. "If Derek took it, why would he leave it under a bed in a motel room, and not even the room he's staying in?" My unease deepened as I examined the pocket watch, unquestionably Thomas's, the monogrammed case and inscription inside the lid confirming its authenticity. The circumstances felt deliberately arranged, though to what purpose remained unclear. "Who was staying in this room?" James asked the housekeeper, his tone conversational but intent. She shrugged. "No see. Only find things when clean." As Sarah continued examining her recovered laptop, her expression shifted from relief to growing alarm. "Mom," she said quietly, "someone's been using this. There are files open that I didn't access, folders that have been moved." The pieces suddenly aligned in my mind. Diane's confident parting shot, the convenient discovery, the evidence of tampering with Sarah's computer. "We need to leave," I said urgently. "Now, and we need to contact Sheriff Wilson." James, who had been examining the room with increasing suspicion, nodded in agreement. "This entire scenario has been staged. The question is why." We thanked the housekeeper, who seemed relieved at our departure, and returned to our vehicle with the recovered items. Sarah clutched her laptop protectively, the watch secured in her pocket. "They wanted us to find these," I said, as James drove us away from the motel. "Specifically, they wanted us to recover the laptop after someone had accessed it." "But what would they be looking for?" Sarah asked, her earlier relief now completely replaced by concern. "My client files? Financial records? Access," I realized suddenly, the final piece clicking into place. "Your passwords, your accounts." Thomas kept digital backups of important documents. "Did he ever share those with you?" Sarah's eyes widened with recognition. "He set me up as his digital executor. All the trust documents, property records, financial accounts, they're stored in a secure cloud folder I can access." She opened her laptop again, navigating quickly through folders, including... "Oh no. What is it?" James asked, glancing in the rearview mirror with obvious concern. "The Wyoming property documentation," Sarah confirmed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "All the mineral rights leases, the trust account information, everything. It's all in a folder Dad labeled Contingency Plan B. And someone with access to your computer could have found it," I concluded grimly. "That's what Diane meant by their ace. They've discovered the Wyoming property." James pulled the car to the side of the road, turning to face us fully. This changes our defensive strategy. If they know about the secondary property and mineral rights, they'll adjust their legal approach accordingly. They'll try to claim it's marital property, Sarah realized, her legal knowledge from years of living with Thomas evident in her quick analysis. That Derek has rights to it as my husband, or at least to a portion as part of a divorce settlement, which is exactly why Thomas placed it in a separate trust with you as the sole beneficiary years before your marriage, I reminded her. He anticipated this precise scenario. But they don't know that part, Sarah said slowly, understanding dawning. They've seen the property documentation, but not the trust structure. They think they've discovered a hidden asset they can claim. James nodded, his expression shifting from concern to strategic calculation. Which gives us an advantage. They'll move based on incomplete information, thinking they've found your vulnerability. While actually walking into a trap Thomas set years ago, I finished, feeling a renewed appreciation for my husband's foresight. We continued toward the sheriff's office to report the suspicious circumstances of the discovery, each of us contemplating the implications of this new development. The Prescotts believed they had found a weakness to exploit, a valuable property they could claim through Derek's marital connection to Sarah. What they didn't yet realize was that their discovery had actually activated the final phase of Thomas's protective strategy, a phase designed not merely to defend our assets, but to decisively end any threat the Prescotts might pose to our family's security. As James had noted earlier, Thomas had indeed thought of everything, including the possibility that our adversaries might discover the Wyoming property. What they would soon learn was that this discovery didn't strengthen their position. It fundamentally undermined it in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Dad would appreciate the irony, Sarah observed quietly as we neared town. They think they found his secret when actually they've walked right into his plan. Your father always said the best legal strategy isn't about concealment, I recalled, but about creating situations where your opponent's apparent advantage becomes their greatest vulnerability. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt not just determined, but quietly confident. The Prescotts had made their move, exactly as Thomas had anticipated years ago. Now it was our turn, and we would be playing with a rulebook they didn't even know existed. They've taken the bait, James confirmed, setting his phone down on my kitchen table with an expression of professional satisfaction. Parker filed an amended complaint this morning, specifically referencing newly discovered assets deliberately concealed during the marriage. 3 days had passed since the suspicious recovery of Sarah's laptop and Thomas's watch. 3 days we'd spent preparing for precisely this development. Sheriff Wilson had documented the questionable circumstances of the discovery, adding to our growing file of evidence regarding the Prescotts' activities. How specific is the filing? I asked, pouring coffee for the three of us. The morning sunlight streamed through windows Sarah had cleaned yesterday in one of her bursts of nervous energy, a childhood habit that had apparently carried into adulthood. Remarkably specific, James replied, accepting his mug with a nod of thanks. They've identified the Wyoming property by exact address and parcel number, referenced the mineral rights leases by contract dates, even mentioned the quarterly income figures to the penny. Sarah winced slightly. Those were in a spreadsheet Dad maintained. I should have been more careful with my passwords. You couldn't have anticipated this level of invasion, I assured her. Besides, your father certainly did. James nodded agreement, removing additional documents from his briefcase. Parker's amended complaint now demands half the value of the Wyoming property as marital assets, plus retrospective payment of 50% of all mineral rights income generated during the marriage. That's millions of dollars, Sarah noted, her expression more thoughtful than alarmed. They must think they've hit the jackpot, which makes their eventual realization all the more satisfying, James replied, with the subtle satisfaction of a lawyer whose carefully laid trap had been sprung. I've prepared our response, including the complete trust documentation establishing the property's legal status. He spread the documents before us. The irrevocable trust Thomas had established 15 years ago, naming Sarah as sole beneficiary with specific language, excluding the property from any future marital assets. The date of establishment, 7 years before Sarah had even met Derek, was prominently featured, as was the separate LLC structure that legally owned the mineral rights leases. This effectively neutralizes their entire claim, James explained. The Wyoming property was never marital property by any legal definition. Derek has no more claim to it than a stranger off the street. How quickly will Parker recognize the futility of their position? I asked. Any competent attorney would see it immediately, James replied. Whether Parker advises his clients accordingly is another matter. The Prescotts strike me as people who might insist on pursuing losing strategies out of sheer stubbornness. Particularly Diane, Sarah agreed. She's never admitted being wrong about anything in all the years I've known her. I considered this assessment, remembering Diane's confident parting comment about their supposed ace. They'll need a face-saving way to retreat, I observed. Some concession that allows them to claim at least partial victory. What about Derek's personal belongings still at the house? Sarah suggested. We could offer to return them without further legal complications. A reasonable starting point, James acknowledged, though I suspect they'll push for more, perhaps a small cash settlement to cover Derek's supposed improvements to the property. I nodded, seeing the path forward. We can be flexible on minor matters while remaining absolutely firm on the core issues of property ownership. Precisely the approach Thomas would recommend, James agreed with approval. Principled, but pragmatic. Our strategy session was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel, a now familiar harbinger of Prescott intrusions. Sarah moved to the window, her posture tensing as she identified the approaching vehicle. Derek's truck, she reported. Alone this time. James and I exchanged glances of professional assessment. A solo appearance suggested either a retreat from the family's united front or a different tactical approach. Let me handle this, Sarah said with unexpected firmness. It's time Derek and I had an honest conversation without lawyers or parents present. The determination in her voice, so reminiscent of Thomas at his most resolute, gave me pause. Since the beginning of this ordeal, I'd instinctively positioned myself as her protector, the experienced strategist managing our defense. But watching her now, shoulders squared and expression composed, I recognized that my daughter had found her own strength amid the chaos of betrayal. Are you certain? I asked, not to undermine her decision, but to confirm her readiness. Yes, she replied simply. This started between Derek and me. It's fitting that the beginning of the end should be the same. James cleared his throat softly. Perhaps I should remain nearby, not present for your conversation, but available if legal matters arise. Sarah considered this, then nodded. That seems prudent. By the time Derek's knock came at the front door, Sarah had positioned herself in the living room, deliberately selecting Thomas's armchair, a subtle psychological power move that would not be lost on her husband. James and I withdrew to the kitchen, close enough to intervene if necessary, but removed enough to grant the privacy this confrontation required. Derek, I heard Sarah greet him, her voice neutral but not hostile. Come in. From our position, I could see Derek's silhouette as he entered, shoulders hunched defensively despite his attempt at confident posture. He remained standing awkwardly while Sarah sat composed in her father's chair. You found your laptop? He began, the statement halfway between question and accusation. Yes, Sarah confirmed, along with my father's watch, in interesting circumstances. Derek shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Look, I didn't take your things. My parents may have packed some of your stuff when we were reorganizing the house, but I wasn't involved in that. Reorganizing. Sarah's tone made the euphemism sound as ridiculous as it was. Is that what we're calling locking me out of my home and watching me stand in the rain for 6 hours? To my surprise, Derek's posture deflated slightly, a flash of what appeared to be genuine regret crossing his features. That went too far. I was angry that you'd questioned my financial decisions. My parents got involved and things escalated. Things escalated, Sarah repeated, each word precise and measured. That's a convenient way to avoid responsibility for your actions. Derek ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd witnessed countless times during his marriage to Sarah. Fine. I was wrong to lock you out. I admit that. But you and your mother haven't exactly been forthcoming either, have you? All these secret properties and mineral rights leases hidden from me throughout our marriage? So they were indeed pursuing the Wyoming property angle, as we'd anticipated. Sarah's composure didn't waver. Nothing was hidden, Derek. My financial disclosures during our marriage were complete and accurate. The Wyoming property isn't mine. It's held in a trust established by my father years before we met. A trust conveniently naming you as beneficiary, Derek countered, his voice regaining its confrontational edge. Property worth millions that you never once mentioned in 7 years of marriage. Because it wasn't relevant to our marriage, Sarah replied evenly. The trust explicitly excludes it from marital assets. My father established it as a separate inheritance years before I even knew you existed. Derek's scoff was audible from the kitchen. Convenient timing. I suppose your father just happened to anticipate you'd marry someone he disapproved of. No, Sarah corrected, her voice steady. He anticipated I might marry someone who would value property over people. Someone who might view family legacy as a commodity to be liquidated rather than a heritage to be preserved. The silence that followed held its own weight, filled with truths neither had fully articulated during their marriage. Our attorneys can argue about trust structures, Derek finally said, his tone shifting towards something more calculating. But there's a simpler solution here, one that benefits everyone and avoids costly legal battles. I'm listening, Sarah prompted, though her tone suggested skepticism. A clean break, Derek proposed. I drop all claims to the Wyoming property. You drop the criminal complaints about the laptop and watch. We proceed with an uncontested divorce, splitting our actual marital assets fairly. And the farm? Sarah asked, the critical question hanging between them. Derek hesitated just long enough to reveal his continued designs on the property. We could arrange a fair market valuation, perhaps sell a portion to Clearwater. No. Sarah's interruption was firm, but not angry. The farm is not negotiable. Not 1 acre. Not the north pasture. Not any part of it. Be reasonable, Sarah, Derek pressed. That property is worth more than money, she finished for him. Something you've never understood. The farm isn't just land and buildings. It's 5 generations of my family's history. It's where my father's ashes are scattered. It's the foundation of everything the Reynolds family has built. Sentimentality is expensive, Derek countered, his tone hardening. That land could set us both up for life if developed properly. And that, Sarah said quietly, is exactly why my father protected it the way he did, because he anticipated someone valuing its development potential over its heritage. From my position in the kitchen, I could see Derek's posture shifting, the momentary vulnerability replaced by the calculating demeanor that had likely prompted Thomas's concerns years ago. Your father didn't trust me, he stated flatly. From the beginning. My father, Sarah corrected gently, hoped for the best while preparing for the worst. A philosophy that's proven remarkably prescient, wouldn't you say? Another loaded silence stretched between them, filled with the wreckage of their marriage and the fundamentally different values that had doomed it from the start. So where does that leave us? Derek finally asked, an edge of defeat entering his voice for the first time. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her posture relaxed but purposeful. It leaves us with a choice. Continue an expensive, unwinnable legal battle that will only benefit our attorneys, or accept reality and move forward separately. And what does accepting reality look like in your view? Derek's tone held lingering suspicion. You drop all claims to the farm and the Wyoming property, Sarah outlined calmly. I drop the criminal complaints regarding my possessions. We file an uncontested divorce with equitable division of our actual marital assets, which, as you know, are minimal given your business losses last year. I suppressed a smile at this precise jab. Thomas would have appreciated the strategic reminder of Derek's financial missteps embedded within an ostensibly generous offer. And Clearwater, Derek pressed, revealing his continued fixation on the development potential. We'll need to find another property, Sarah replied firmly. The farm is not for sale. Not now, not ever. Derek was silent for a long moment, likely calculating his options and finding them increasingly limited. I need to consult with my attorney, he finally said, the standard retreat when confronted with unfavorable terms. Of course, Sarah agreed reasonably. But be aware that our counterclaim includes full documentation of your unauthorized negotiations with Clearwater, which potentially constitutes wire fraud given your misrepresentation of ownership rights. Sheriff Wilson has expressed particular interest in that aspect of the case. The implied threat was delivered with such calm precision that I felt a surge of maternal pride. Sarah had absorbed not just Thomas's principles, but his tactical acumen as well. You'd press criminal charges against your own husband? Derek's incredulity seemed genuine. Ex-husband, Sarah corrected mildly, and I'd prefer not to. Hence this conversation and the opportunity to resolve matters without further escalation. Derek's departure minutes later carried none of the bluster or threats that had characterized previous Prescott exits. He left quietly, shoulders slumped with the dawning recognition that his position was fundamentally untenable. When Sarah rejoined us in the kitchen, her composure remained intact, though I could see the emotional toll the confrontation had taken in the slight trembling of her hands. "That was masterfully handled," James observed with professional appreciation. "Indeed," I agreed, embracing my daughter briefly. "Your father would have been proud." "He gave me the tools," Sarah said simply. "All of this, the trusts, the documentation, the legal structures, they were his gifts to us. I'm just following the path he laid out." As we settled back at the kitchen table to discuss next steps, I found myself reflecting on Thomas's extraordinary foresight. He had anticipated not just the potential threat Derek might pose, but the strength Sarah would need to find within herself to confront it. His preparations weren't merely legal protections, but opportunities for growth, challenges designed to reveal our capabilities rather than simply shield us from harm. The battle wasn't yet over. Derek's retreat to consult his attorney suggested the Prescotts weren't ready to concede defeat completely, but the dynamic had shifted decisively in our favor. For the first time since this ordeal began, I sensed not just hope for resolution, but confidence in victory, on terms that would preserve both our property and our dignity. Thomas's chess game was approaching its endgame, with our opponents suddenly recognizing they'd been maneuvered into an inescapable position, not through deception or manipulation, but through careful preparation and principled determination, just as he would have wanted it. The Prescotts' final stand came 3 days later, delivered not through legal channels, but in the form of an unexpected visit from Robert Prescott. Unlike previous intrusions, he arrived alone in his modest sedan rather than the luxury SUV Diane typically insisted upon, and he called ahead, a courtesy so unprecedented it immediately aroused my suspicion. "Just Robert," I confirmed after answering his call. "No Derek, no Diane, no attorneys or photographers. Just me," he assured me, his voice carrying a weariness I hadn't detected in our previous encounters. "I'd like to speak with you directly, Martha. Without the legal posturing and family drama, would that be possible?" I considered his request carefully. Robert had always been the most reasonable of the Prescotts, a successful accountant who'd built his practice through diligence rather than the aggressive tactics his wife and son preferred. Though he'd participated in their scheme to appropriate our property, he'd shown occasional flashes of discomfort with their more extreme methods. "You may come at 2 o'clock, I decided. "For 30 minutes, just you and me." "Thank you," he replied, genuine relief in his tone. "I appreciate your willingness to hear me out." After ending the call, I consulted with Sarah and James, both of whom advised caution while acknowledging the potential value of direct communication with the most moderate Prescott. "It could be a genuine olive branch," James suggested, "or another strategy to gather information for their legal maneuvering. Either way, I'll be careful," I assured them. "And I'll have both of you nearby, just in case." Robert arrived precisely at 2. The punctuality I'd always appreciated about him in stark contrast to Derek's habitual lateness and Diane's strategic arrivals timed for maximum effect. He parked carefully, approached the house with measured steps, and waited on the porch rather than knocking immediately, small courtesies that suggested genuine respect for boundaries. I met him at the door, noting the subtle signs of strain in his appearance, the slight dishevelment of his typically immaculate attire, the shadows beneath his eyes suggesting recent sleepless nights. "Thank you for seeing me, Martha," he said as I invited him in, his tone holding none of the combative energy that had characterized their previous visits. I led him to the living room, deliberately choosing seats that placed us on equal footing rather than the power dynamic Sarah had established with Derek. This conversation, I sensed, required a different approach. "Would you like coffee? Tea?" I offered, basic hospitality that seemed to surprise him slightly. "Coffee would be wonderful," he admitted. "It's been a challenging few days." When I returned with 2 mugs, I found Robert studying the family photographs on our mantelpiece, generations of Reynolds captured in silver frames, including a prominent image of Thomas in his judge's robes during his temporary appointment. "Your husband was widely respected in the legal community," Robert observed as I handed him his coffee. "Even those who opposed him in court acknowledged his integrity and fairness." "Yes," I agreed simply. "Thomas believed in justice rather than victory, a distinction some attorneys never quite grasp." Robert smiled faintly at the implied criticism of Gregory Parker. Indeed, he sipped his coffee, organizing his thoughts before continuing. Martha, I've come to discuss a resolution to our situation, unofficially, without attorneys present. I'm listening, I replied, maintaining a neutral expression despite my curiosity about this unexpected approach. Robert set his mug down carefully on a coaster, another small courtesy that distinguished him from his family. The amended complaint referencing the Wyoming property has been withdrawn, he stated without preamble, as have all claims regarding the farm. Derek has instructed Parker to prepare uncontested divorce papers with standard division of actual marital assets, as Sarah suggested. Moi. Though this was precisely the outcome we'd been working toward, the sudden capitulation caught me by surprise. That's quite a reversal from your family's previous position, I observed. May I ask what prompted this change? Robert was silent for a moment, his expression shifting between embarrassment and resignation. 2 factors primarily, he finally said. First, Parker finally examined the trust documentation James provided and confirmed what you've maintained all along. The Wyoming property is legally untouchable, established years before Sarah met Derek. I nodded, having anticipated this legal reality check. And the second factor? Robert met my gaze directly, an unexpected dignity in his bearing. I've left Diane, he said quietly, filed for separation 3 days ago, after 42 years of marriage. This I had not anticipated. The Prescotts had always presented a united front, with Robert typically supporting Diane's ambitions despite occasional indications of discomfort with her methods. I'm sorry, I offered, genuine despite our adversarial position. Marriage dissolution at our age carried unique sorrows, regardless of circumstances. Don't be, Robert replied with surprising firmness. It's long overdue. This situation with your property, it was a breaking point, but not the cause. Diane's approach to life has always been different from mine. More aggressive, more acquisitive. I accommodated it for decades, looked the other way when her methods crossed ethical lines. He paused, gathering himself before continuing. But what she and Derek did to Sarah, locking her out, leaving her in the rain, taking her possessions, that was a line I couldn't let them cross, not with my tacit approval through silence. The revelation shifted my understanding of the family dynamics that had been arrayed against us. I'd viewed the Prescotts as a unified force, but clearly there had been fractures beneath the surface that our situation had merely exposed rather than created. The Wyoming property was the final straw, Robert continued, his tone reflecting a mixture of disgust and relief. When Diane discovered it through Sarah's laptop, a violation I wasn't aware of until after the fact, she became obsessed with claiming it, started making plans for what she'd do with her share of the mineral rights income. When I suggested the trust documentation likely made such claims impossible, she accused me of lacking ambition, of always settling for less than we deserved. A familiar criticism? I guessed, recognizing the pattern from my limited interactions with Diane. A lifelong refrain, Robert confirmed with a sad smile. My accounting practice was never prestigious enough, our house never quite large enough, our vacations never quite exotic enough. There was always more to be acquired, more to be displayed, more to prove our success to people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered. The vulnerability of this confession, this peeling back of the careful facade the Prescotts had maintained, created an unexpected moment of human connection between us. Whatever our differences, we shared the experience of long marriages and the complex negotiations they entailed. So you've withdrawn support for their legal maneuvers, I summarized, bringing us back to the practical implications. Completely, Robert confirmed. Without my financial backing, they can't sustain the legal battle. Parker requires substantial retainers for his services, and Derek's business has been struggling for years, another reality Diane refused to acknowledge. This explained much about Derek's desperate fixation on our property. Not just greed, but financial necessity, driving his attempts to access what he perceived as untapped value. What do you want from this conversation, Robert? I asked directly, sensing there was more to his visit than simply informing me of their retreat. He hesitated, an uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing his features. 2 things, if I may. First, an apology, for my part in this situation, for not intervening sooner when Diane and Derek crossed ethical and legal lines. My silence enabled their actions, and I regret that deeply. The apology seemed genuine, unmarked by the calculated positioning that had characterized previous Prescott communications. "And the second thing?" I prompted. "Your perspective," he said simply, "on how Thomas prepared so thoroughly for a threat he couldn't have specifically foreseen. The trusts, the legal structures, the documentation, it's remarkably comprehensive, protecting against vulnerabilities most people wouldn't even identify." The question touched on something I'd reflected on frequently during this ordeal: Thomas's extraordinary foresight and the careful preparations he'd made for our security long before any specific threat emerged. "Thomas didn't prepare for Derek specifically," I explained after a thoughtful pause. "He prepared for the pattern Derek represents. In 4 decades of legal practice, he encountered countless situations where families lost land or assets that had been in their care for generations, sometimes through financial necessity, sometimes through predatory actions by others, often through simple lack of proper legal protection." Robert nodded his understanding. "Preventive rather than reactive planning." "Precisely," I confirmed. "Thomas believed in building secure foundations rather than erecting hasty defenses during a crisis. The trusts, the separate property arrangements, the careful documentation, these weren't created in response to Derek, but as part of a comprehensive approach to protecting what matters most. A philosophy with applications beyond legal structures," Robert observed with surprising insight. "Yes," I agreed, "in all aspects of life." As our conversation concluded and Robert prepared to leave, he paused at the door, a final thought seemingly occurring to him. "Martha, may I ask one more question? About Sarah and the Wyoming property?" I nodded cautiously, still maintaining some reserve despite our unexpectedly candid exchange. "Does she intend to relocate there? After the divorce is finalized?" The question held no obvious strategic value for the Prescotts' now abandoned legal maneuvering, seeming to stem from genuine curiosity. "That's Sarah's decision to make," I replied, "though the property offers a fresh start away from painful associations here." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "And you? Would you go with her?" The question touched on deliberations Sarah and I had indeed been having, private conversations about future plans and potential new beginnings. "That too remains undecided," I answered honestly, though Thomas thoughtfully included accommodations for me in his planning, should I choose that path. "Of course he did," Robert said with a small, sad smile. "Thomas Reynolds thought of everything. Diane never understood why I respected him so much. A country lawyer who could have pursued wealth and prestige, but chose to serve his community instead. I wish I'd had half his clarity about what truly matters." With that surprisingly revealing statement, Robert Prescott departed, not as an adversary retreating in defeat, but as a man taking his first steps on a different path after decades of compromise and accommodation. Whatever the Prescotts had intended when they changed our locks and declared we didn't live here anymore, I doubted they'd anticipated this outcome. Not just our successful defense of our property, but the fracturing of their own carefully maintained facade of family unity. As I watched Robert's car disappear down our driveway, I felt an unexpected sympathy for him. A man who had finally chosen integrity over expediency, though at considerable personal cost. Thomas would have appreciated the irony that our adversary's greatest defeat came not from our actions, but from their own internal reckonings. The chess game was indeed concluding, though with moves none of us had fully anticipated. 1 year later, I stood on the wide porch of the Wyoming ranch house, watching autumn sunlight gild the distant Tetons with late afternoon radiance. Aspen groves dotted the rolling landscape, their leaves transformed into shimmering gold by the season's first cold snap. The beauty was breathtaking, simultaneously vast and intimate, a perfect embodiment of the legacy Thomas had secured for our family. "Tea, Mom?" Sarah emerged from the house, carrying 2 steaming mugs. Her appearance had changed subtly but significantly during our months in Wyoming. The strained vigilance that had marked her features during the conflict with Derek replaced by quiet confidence, her city wardrobe exchanged for practical clothes suited to ranch life. "Thank you, dear." I accepted the mug gratefully, the warmth welcome against the crisp mountain air. "Has James called with the final paperwork?" Sarah nodded, settling into the Adirondack chair beside mine. "Just finished the call. The transfer is complete. The farm is officially incorporated into the Conservation Trust. No development can occur on that land for at least the next century." "Thomas would be pleased," I said, satisfaction warming me even more than the tea. Preservation was always his priority. Our decision regarding the Missouri farm had evolved gradually over months of consideration. While the property remained our legal residence, our extended stay in Wyoming had revealed unexpected possibilities for both of us. Sarah finding renewal in the distance from painful memories, me discovering that change could be invigorating rather than merely disruptive at my age. The solution, when it finally crystallized, felt like something Thomas himself might have architected, transforming the Missouri property into a conservation trust that preserved its historical and environmental significance while allowing us the freedom to build new lives in Wyoming. The farmhouse and immediate grounds remained available for our use whenever we visited, but the land itself was now permanently protected from the development schemes that had threatened it. "I received a letter from Robert Prescott this morning," Sarah mentioned, her tone carefully neutral. "Forwarded from Missouri." "Oh?" I kept my response equally measured, though the mention of any Prescott still triggered a protective vigilance. "What did he want?" "To inform us that his divorce from Diane is final," Sarah replied, "and that Derek has relocated to Florida. Apparently Clearwater offered him a position in their East Coast division after the Missouri development fell through." "Distance suits them," I observed. The Prescotts' retreat from our lives had been as complete as their earlier invasion had been aggressive. After Robert's unexpected visit and confession, legal communications had continued through attorneys. The divorce proceedings progressed without drama, and the small community that had rallied around us gradually forgot the conflict as newer local controversies emerged. "Robert also mentioned he started volunteer work with a rural legal aid clinic," Sarah continued, a note of surprised approval in her voice, "helping farmers and landowners with estate planning and property protection, specifically to prevent situations like ours. Redemption comes in unexpected forms," I mused. Of all the outcomes I might have anticipated when this ordeal began, Robert Prescott finding purpose in helping others avoid similar predatory situations would have been among the least likely. He asked if we would consider allowing him to use our case as an anonymous example in his educational outreach, Sarah added. "No names or identifying details, just the legal structures Dad created and how effectively they protected our property." I considered this request, finding no objection rising within me. Thomas would approve, I think. He always believed in education as the best preventive measure. That's what I thought, too. Sarah sipped her tea, watching golden light shift across the distant mountains. "I told Robert I'd discuss it with you, but that I was inclined to agree, with appropriate anonymity protections, of course." We sat in companionable silence for several minutes, each following our private thoughts while sharing the magnificent landscape before us. The Wyoming property had proven to be everything Thomas had envisioned and more, not merely a financial security measure, but a place of healing and possibility for both Sarah and me. The guest house Thomas had mentioned in his letter to Sarah had become my private sanctuary, close enough for daily interaction with my daughter, but separate enough to maintain our independence. Sarah had transformed the main house with her designer's eye, blending the original rustic elements with contemporary touches that made the space uniquely hers rather than simply an inherited property. "I submitted the final designs for the education center today," Sarah mentioned, returning to a project that had increasingly engaged her creative energies. The planned facility would occupy a corner of the property, offering workshops on sustainable land management and conservation strategies for local ranchers and landowners. "What did the architects say about your modifications to the community space?" I asked, genuinely interested in her vision for the center. "They love the central skylight concept," she replied, enthusiasm animating her features. "It will flood the meeting area with natural light while creating a direct connection to the landscape." She paused, a smile softening her expression. "I'm incorporating some elements from Dad's study at the farm. The built-in bookshelves, the reading nooks, that sense of being surrounded by knowledge. He would be honored," I said softly, "and thoroughly delighted by how you've reimagined this property's purpose." The education center represented Sarah's own contribution to Thomas's legacy, not merely preserving what he had built, but extending it in directions that honored his values while reflecting her unique vision. Through its programs, the legal protections and conservation principles Thomas had championed would reach new generations, creating ripple effects far beyond our immediate family. A familiar sound interrupted our contemplation, the distinctive rumble of John Wilson's truck approaching along our private road. The former sheriff had retired from law enforcement shortly after our conflict with the Prescotts concluded, accepting our invitation to serve as property manager for the Wyoming ranch. His practical knowledge and unflappable demeanor had proven invaluable during our transition to part-time Western living. "Right on schedule," Sarah observed as John's truck appeared around the bend. "He must have finished the fence repair on the north section." I checked my watch, smiling at the predictability. 4 o'clock exactly. The man runs on atomic precision. John parked near the barn and approached with his characteristic unhurried stride, removing his hat as he reached the porch steps. "Afternoon, ladies. North fence is secured. No more unwelcome visits from the neighbor's cattle." "Thank you, John," Sarah acknowledged. "Would you like some coffee? We were just discussing the education center plans." "Don't mind if I do," he accepted, settling into the third Adirondack chair that had become informally designated as his during our evening debriefs. "Architects approve your changes?" As Sarah updated him on the project's progress, I found myself observing the easy rapport they had developed over the past year. John's widower status and Sarah's divorce had initially created a father-daughter dynamic between them, but recently, I'd noticed subtle shifts suggesting potential for deeper connection. At 56, John was considerably older than Sarah, but their shared values and complementary personalities had formed the foundation for a friendship that seemed to be gradually evolving into something more. Thomas would approve, I thought, watching Sarah's animated gestures as she described her vision for the education center. He had always valued substance over superficial considerations in relationships, prioritizing character and compatibility above conventional expectations. John Wilson possessed the integrity and steadfastness Thomas had exemplified, qualities Sarah had recognized were lacking in Derek despite his more obvious attributes. "What do you think, Mom?" Sarah's question pulled me from my reflections. "About naming the main hall after Dad? Too sentimental?" "Not at all," I replied sincerely. "The Thomas Reynolds Memorial Hall has a fitting dignity to it, though knowing your father, he'd suggest some self-deprecating alternative. The read the fine print before signing anything auditorium," Sarah suggested with a laugh that carried no bitterness, only fond remembrance. "Or the plan ahead because life is unpredictable. Lecture room," John added, his dry humor a perfect complement to our family's style. As laughter warmed our small circle, I felt Thomas's presence more strongly than I had in months. Not as a painful absence, but as a continuing influence whose wisdom remained alive in the choices we made and the values we honored. His foresight had given us not just security, but options, not merely protection, but possibilities. The sun dipped lower toward the Tetons, casting long shadows across the rolling pasture land that stretched between our porch and the distant mountains. Soon the aspens would lose their golden leaves, the first snows would dust the higher elevations, and the ranch would settle into its winter rhythms. But unlike our first difficult winter of adjustment after leaving Missouri, this year we faced the changing season with established routines and growing confidence in our new beginning. "To Thomas," I said spontaneously, raising my mug in an impromptu toast, "who gave us roots strong enough to withstand any storm and wings when we needed to fly." "To Dad," Sarah echoed, raising her own mug, "who protected what mattered most." John joined our toast with quiet respect, understanding the significance of this moment of acknowledgement. As our mugs clinked together in the golden light of Wyoming autumn, I felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but a circle closing perfectly before opening into new possibilities. The legacy Thomas had built extended far beyond property and legal protections. It lived in the values that guided our decisions, in the strength that had emerged from facing adversity, and in the wisdom of knowing what truly constituted our most precious inheritance, not the land itself, but the love that had shaped our family across generations. "Yes," I whispered, as twilight softened the mountain silhouettes, "we don't live there anymore, but we carried home with us all along."